All right, hey everyone. Welcome back to another live stream. And we have Joel joining us from Browserless. And today we're going to do a lot of hands-on stuff. So very excited. Before we get started, Joel, would you like to tell the viewers a little bit more about yourself and what you do and what they can expect from this live webinar?
Yeah. So, hey everyone, I'm Joel Griffith. I'm the CEO of Browserless.io. It's a web browser like automation software as a service. And yeah, today we're going to do a pretty deep dive into PDF generation. Talk a lot about that, pitfalls, how to do it, other ways of doing it besides the way we like to do it at Browserless, and just kind of go through some edge cases and other things like that. Yeah, show some code. Should be a good time. Hopefully, we'll learn something.
Amazing. Well, could not agree more. And yeah, if you have any questions, everyone, you can share it in the live chat. We're streaming it on YouTube, Twitter, and LinkedIn at once. So we'll be answering the questions in the end as well. Let me just share the screen here and add Joel in. Joel, take it away.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for the time. Hope you all are having a good day, morning, evening, wherever you are. So yeah, here's the agenda for today. And I want to preface this by saying we're going to cover a lot. Everybody's experience is different here. So I'm sorry if it doesn't reach the level of technical knowledge that you have. I'm hoping that everybody walks away with something and understands a bit more about PDF generation and what it is and what it isn't, and just some common stuff with it. That being said, we all have different technical backgrounds. We all have different understanding of languages, libraries, and things of that nature. So a lot of the code is in Node.js and JavaScript. That doesn't mean that all of this stuff is only in Node and in JavaScript. That's the language that we primarily work at with my Browserless. But there absolutely is like Python libraries. There absolutely is Java, C Sharp, all the other big famous ones, PHP even. So we won't get into that. But if you're dealing with PHP, good luck. But yeah, obviously this is the agenda. We're gonna crush through a lot of stuff again. Please save your questions to the end. I will try to read and pick through some questions to talk about. PDF is a big, complex topic. And so my understanding is pretty deep, but there's probably going to be stuff where I'm going to be like, I don't know, go look that up because that's beyond my realm of expertise. So apologies if I can't answer your questions at the end, but please do save them for the end, and hopefully we'll have time. So yeah, like I mentioned, I am Joel. I run Browserless. Browserless is a web automation company, TM. So what does that mean? We run headless browsers for numerous tasks. A lot of it is data collection, aggregation, but a big part of it is also PDF generation and screenshot generation as well. Prior to Browserless, I ran reporting infrastructure at Elastic in their Kibana application. And so that used a lot of PDF generation and PNG generation. And the approach that we're going to talk about a little bit later is the approach that we sort of had at Elastic, though we didn't necessarily have, I would say, a great infrastructure setup for that. So we'll talk a little bit about that too as well, and kind of some guidelines there. And then the last thing I always like to say is PDF for reporting is like owning cats. Owning cats is great for the most part. They're nice. You get to pet them. They're your pet. They're your, partner for life. When things are great, they're awesome. But you got to deal with a litter box. You got to deal with a cat scratching furniture, being a nuisance, running outside, whatever. So it's not without pitfalls. And like owning multiple cats, PDF is a lot like herding cats. So there's going to be times where, what's this one doing? Where is this one at? And PDF reporting shares a lot of those similarities. So yeah, that's my really terrible metaphor for this talk. So we're done with it. You're welcome. So before I want to get into PDFs, I kind of want to paint a picture of what PDFs are and what they're not, just to kind of give you an idea if you've never dealt with them at scale implementing some of these features. So PDF is just an acronym. It's a portable document format. The idea for PDFs is everything that you need to print a page of something is self-contained. It doesn't necessarily need to call out to external resources and load like an HTML page would or a website would. It's pretty much all embedded into one kind of container and is ready to go. You can put in images, text, links. Obviously, links will just click open to a web browser, and then you can run with it from there. But images and text need to be like embedded inside of that PDF. So PDFs can also be very heavy for that reason. If you have like special fonts or web fonts, when the PDF is rendered, those have to be kind of there and available as it's rendered, and they get embedded inside the PDF. So that can be kind of troublesome later when you're trying to figure out like, why is this PDF 20 megabytes? Probably is a font, probably is a big image or some other asset that's in there. So yeah, I want to stress the portable part, because at the end of the day, this thing has to be totally self-contained. I like to say that PDFs are to printing as Docker is to software. So if you're familiar with Docker or any sort of containers, all of the assets that you need to run the service and code that you need to run the service are already built into the Docker container. So when you get the container, it's already kind of ready to go. PDFs are sort of like that for static assets. Everything is in there. It's ready to go. There's no other additional steps required, assuming that you have an application to open the PDF and render it or print it. Everything is there, and there shouldn't be anything else needed. But PDFs are the wild west of printing, so all sorts of stuff can happen. Yeah, so what aren't PDFs? PDFs are not really semantic. There's a whole bunch of different specs. There's different versions of PDFs. They all include different, formats. A lot of the times, if you were to open a PDF in text editors, there isn't a lot you can do with them. So if you think about like scanning something that you've printed as a PDF, that's just an image, right? That got scanned into a PDF. So there's really not text that you can select or, look at. Some of these encoding standards also mean you can't see raw data inside of that PDF, which makes it really hard to figure out what's going on with the PDF after it's already been rendered, right? Almost the same sort of situation like with Docker, again, using that example. When you have a Docker container and you're running it, like let's say you're using Go. Go builds a binary, you put that binary inside the container. To try to debug what's going on in your Go program is impossible at that point, because it's already been rendered into a binary. You can't really do much with it. PDFs are the same. So instead of trying to debug a PDF after the fact that it's been generated, it's almost always better to have a system in place that can render PDFs in a sane way that you can, debug elsewhere, because once it's rendered into a PDF, a lot of the stuff that you could look at is gone at that point. PDFs, for that reason, in my opinion, are not very developer friendly, unless you have some like really good debugging tools to open a PDF. Like if you pay for Adobe and can edit PDFs that way, like that's a decent way of getting into, a PDF and like moving text around and whatnot. But usually once a PDF is generated, it's kind of pressed and sealed at that point, like a record. And so you can't really do much with it afterwards. And so, yeah, I really want to stress that point. It's not really easy to work with after the fact. They're built and bundled, they're done, time to move on. So, and for that reason, I always like this little bit too. It's like, if you've ever seen Forrest Gump, Mama always said PDFs are like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. So be prepared for anything and everything. So yeah, now that we know a little bit about what they are, let's talk about making them a little bit. At Elastic, we considered many options for generating PDFs. So our use case was having users generate charts in like a dashboard. So if you're familiar with Kibana or even really any other graphing sort of framework like Grafana, that sort of thing, we wanted to give users a way to take those charts that they had and dashboards that they had built out of Kibana. And a big part of that was doing PDFs or PNGs. We had considered many options at the time, aside from the method I'm going to tell you about. The issue with it is many of these libraries and languages really kind of for doing things server side, generating them server side. There's so many of them. Very few of them are well maintained, or they're very tightly coupled to a specific language. So if you're wanting to use a really nice thing in Java, but your company or organization isn't a Java based, company, then you're going to have a hard time getting that champion through and using, depending upon how that businesses set up. Similarly, a lot of them have really interesting APIs, and they tend to base them off of a standard, but they are themselves not a standard. So you get into this, world where, oh, I got something up and working. I updated the version recently, and now PDFs aren't rendering or they're broken because their API for how PDFs are generated have changed. Um, and then there's just so much stuff on Stack Overflow as far as like issues go. Um, we'll get into that a little bit, but just things like making certain fonts work or images or like rendering a chart, depending upon how that library is set up to handle PDF generation, it may or may not even be possible. And you might be really constrained and limited to what you can do with that library. Using Elastic as an example, we had these really nice charts that were in Kibana, and users wanted to export those. So naturally, they wanted to have something that looked exactly like they had it in Kibana and not something that was wildly different visually. So we needed something that worked with web-based technology and was really consistent in how it rendered and allowed us to do all sorts of stuff with images and fonts, because we allowed people to white label their Kibana instance and things like that. So we really needed something that looked just like it did on the web, but also supported all these other features too that Kibana supported. So I have this as an example of one library that was used for charting. This used like an SVG approach, and as you can imagine, this is very hard to decipher in source code. Like if you were to just pull this up in a code editor, you wouldn't be able to make sense of what this was. But this draws this curvy line. So this is kind of my example of, here's a library that use an SVG based syntax, but if you didn't know SVG or how it operated, or you weren't like a SVG guru, this would almost make no sense. Like just hiding this image and reading this bit of code, we can see we're drawing something on a document path, and it's a stroke style line. It's not a dashed or buff or M dash line. So we don't know what it is. We can't really tell easily from source code what it is. We actually have to like load it into a PDF, generate the PDF, and then look at the fact after the fact to see what it was. So really stressing here is like, debuggability is important, especially when things are like broken in production. It's really, really critical to have a way to like easily reproduce and see something without having to spin up a whole application or service, render what they tried to render, and then see what the output was. Which unfortunately, that's what you get when you use a lot of these libraries, is you have to spin up everything, run a report or whatever to get the output and then see what it is. But then that doesn't really leave you with much because you don't know what any of this means. So yeah, because of that, fonts sometimes don't work, pictures don't work, version control can be difficult too. Anytime somebody touches this line here and alters this curve or whatever, like it's hard to represent that in version control versus a line of JavaScript that draws this for you from some library. So version control, things of that nature kind of fall to the wayside. The other thing that we noticed at Elastic a lot too is different operating systems had really wildly different rendering outputs. So like a good example is Mac versus Windows. Like Mac has very interesting like pixel rendering capabilities where Windows doesn't, and so Windows users were seeing one thing, Mac users were seeing another, depending upon where this was running. And so we got these alternate versions of rendering. And so we were always trying to, make these work well in the prior like graph only, library only approach versus the one we'll talk about later. But, hey, you might have a website already with all this stuff. We certainly did at Elastic. Like I said, we had Kibana, it had dashboards, it was already rendered, and we spent a lot of time making sure that those looked right and performed right. And anytime there was an issue, it got solved quickly. So if you have a website, why don't you just, why can't you just make a PDF of that? So like if I command P this Google presentation, I'll get a PDF of the whole presentation. It's all nice and in slides, and it's kind of ready to go. What if we could just do that? So that's the whole thing. So yeah, Puppeteer, enter Puppeteer. For those who've never used Puppeteer, Puppeteer is a like high-level language to drive Chrome. So think Selenium, but kind of more modern. Puppeteer is backed by Google, and so Google runs this library. Puppeteer is an amazing library, both Puppeteer and there's another one called Playwright. So with Puppeteer or Playwright, it's really simple to launch, a browser, create a new page. On line 4 of this bit of code, I'm emulating print media. And so what that does is it triggers Chrome to enter into print CSS mode. We'll talk about more about that later. And I'm just using an example here from Grafana. So there's a demo Grafana dashboard with time series. And I'm just going to go to that page and then I'm going to make a PDF of it. So this PDF method in both Puppeteer and in Playwright just returns a binary of that PDF. You can save it into the file system. I don't have it in this bit of code, but there is a way you could just save it to the file system as well if that's what you want to do, or upload it to like an S3 bucket, things of that nature. There's a lot that goes on under the hood here, but in 7 short lines of code, you have a working PDF implementation that mostly just works. Obviously, we're talking about a web browser here, so this isn't something that you want to just shove into a production application without thinking a lot about it. When installing Puppeteer, Puppeteer does install a version of Chrome that works with that version of Puppeteer as part of its download. So this isn't something you can just shove into a production app and just expect it to work. There's probably a lot of steps you need to get Chrome working properly, but in terms of code, in terms of reuse, this is great. I really want to stress the amount of importance that this places, because it may not seem like a big deal on the onset, but going with this methodology of having Chromium generate your PDFs, which is the one that we see, or I've seen many people use, it lets you reuse essentially your entire web architecture stack to do PDF generation too. And there's just so many good benefits to that, like all of the version control, all of the other systems that go into play there, all of the testing, QA, like all that stuff also feeds into your PDF generating application. And so if one works, the other one probably is going to work as well. So it's really a great, like, dry thing to do, right? We're not repeating ourselves by trying to separate PDF generation from our web application architecture. They're all kind of combined together, which is really nice. These libraries are also built by Google and Microsoft. So the whole, issue with maintainability, long-term maintenance, all those things is really nice because they're backed by large organizations. It's not just like a one-man project. I will say if you're using Python or Java, some other language besides Node.js, you should go with Playwright. Playwright is pretty much the same API that Puppeteer is. They're almost backwards compatible with each other, or, API compatible with each other. Puppeteer is primarily only for Node.js, and so Puppeteer only works in a Node environment, but Playwright, again, works with Python, Java, C#, and I think more are coming too. So yeah, but otherwise, same pretty much interface. You can PDF with both of them. You can do emulate medias with both of them, all that stuff. So once you have things set up and running, it pretty much just works. There's really not a lot that you need to do or alter. We'll talk a little bit about scaling and like infrastructure here in a few slides, but it's really easy to automate. It's really easy to like inject stuff if you need to. And there's really no need to learn a whole nother API for doing PDF creation. That kind of feeds back into the reuse your entire web architecture, like all the stuff that makes your front end architecture good and your, web services stuff good. All that same stuff will make PDF generation good. So if you do something to improve your site, it'll improve your PDF generation. So yeah, that's all the good stuff. Let's talk about some of the bad stuff, because as always, there's a pros and cons to all these things. So, there is a few out of the box issues that you're likely to run into with Puppeteer and Playwright, and we'll talk about those. I've got them already ready to go. We have blog posts about them that are easily found too, if you run into even more kind of weird edge cases, but they're pretty easily fixed, and we'll talk about that. The one thing that is tricky and that doesn't really have an easy fix is that PDF generation will absolutely consume a lot of RAM in your web architecture. So it almost treats it like an all-you-can-eat buffet if you're familiar with that. So um, if it sees RAM, it'll use it. If you run Chromium with your web application on the same host, the same machine, you're probably going to have a bad time because that Chromium process is just going to chew through all available resources. So for that reason, I like to have Chrome and Puppeteer separate from your main web app. I'll obviously let them be able to communicate with each other, but keep them separated by hardware just because you never know how much Chrome is going to eat resource wise. And you absolutely don't want to bring down your entire web architecture just because, there's a very RAM intensive process going on. Other than that, it's the same stuff that you deal with in typical web apps, like, our graphs done rendering, is the JavaScript done loading, when is a page done loading? That kind of thing is kind of tricky. And we'll talk about that a little bit, some things that can help improve that. But the last point too that's difficult to do is sometimes large PDFs triple equal large slowdown. So the more pages you have of PDFs and the more images, the slower it's going to be to generate them. And we run into issues with customers wanting 200-page PDFs in like 2 seconds, and unfortunately it only works as fast as it will, and there's really nothing you can do to make it go faster unless you want to invest some time making your web architecture quicker. And we'll talk a little bit about that too for those that aren't front end web devs. So yeah, so out of the box, Puppeteer installs Chromium like we talked about, but you're probably going to need a few other packages. The list is so long it didn't fit into a slide here, unfortunately, but you'll want a lot of fonts, to be honest. So if you deal with multi-region, multi-language, multi-locale stuff, you'll want to download those fonts. Google has an amazing set of open source like fonts for, Asian glyphs, any of the Asian languages, all those glyphs, Middle East languages, all those glyphs as well. So you just want to make sure that those fonts are installed on the system that's running this. If you decide to do this in Docker, Puppeteer doesn't install all the dependencies that Chromium needs in Docker. And it's a long, long list. There is a nice document in Puppeteer that goes through kind of like all the operating system requirements you'll need to run Chromium for most Linux distributions. And you'll need all those too. Once you have them in Docker, it's pretty easy, but just as a heads up, it's going to be kind of tricky. It'll require some back and forth. We open sourced our Docker image at Browserless, so just search Browserless on GitHub and you'll see it, and you can look our Docker to see what we do to pull the right images in or the right packages in. Launch arguments. So when you do Puppeteer launch, you can provide it with external or extra CLI flags. So for this instance, like I'm going to set font render hinting to none. This is kind of a special CLI flag to help with rendering fonts more nicely, to put it nicely. And then the other one that you'll want is this force color profile, the sRGB. So by default, Puppeteer's PDF, and I think Playwrights will use WebSafe colors to do the PDF generation. And so you'll have this color disparity between your PDF and your website, which you probably don't want. And printers nowadays are a lot better than they were a long time ago. So I would recommend using that force color profile just because it'll look a lot better and come out through. Puppeteer comes with Chromium bundled with it, but you might want actual Chrome. Chrome comes with a couple extra packages. So like if you're trying to render a PDF that has a video thumbnail or a video in it for some reason, we've seen this a lot with like health insurance and doctors' offices where there'll be like a video for, how to do this treatment or do this stretch or whatever. And they want the thumbnail that goes with it on the PDF. Chrome is a better choice for that because a lot of video encoding technologies come with Chrome, but they don't necessarily come bundled with Chromium. So if something isn't working right with Chromium, I would say try Chrome just to see if that has the little bit of extra stuff that you need to make it render properly. Fonts. Okay, so fonts are a huge, huge topic with this. By default, whatever fonts you have installed on your system that is running Puppeteer and Chromium, those are the fonts that are going to be used when the PDF is generated, which is confusing because you would assume that it's the fonts on the user system, but you got to remember this is running in a backend service away from users. So it's important to have the fonts that your website is expecting to be there present on the system that's running Chrome and Puppeteer. Because that's not always easy to determine what ones you're going to need, I always recommend using web fonts. So web fonts are just a way to load, additional fonts in the web browser to render your page properly. And most websites nowadays use them versus expecting the host system to have them installed. There is a famous issue with using web fonts in Puppeteer because Puppeteer sets a user agent that has headless in it. And this famously broke Google's font system because Google Fonts and other font providers look at that user agent header to determine what fonts that system can use. And so if you have headless in your user agent, those web font services freak out and like, we don't have a web font package that fits that user agent. So here's something that we think might work, and it doesn't. So for that reason, anytime you use Puppeteer to generate a PDF, you also want to set a real user agent header. And that's a very easy call to make. There's a page.setUserAgent, and you're there. So the other one that we've noticed a lot is people like to click links with PDFs. And when they can't do that, it's frustrating. And so there's a little CSS snippet that we like to recommend people add to their page. So this is a page object from Puppeteer. Playwright has the same API as well. So you can add custom CSS styles, which is great because you can hide like nav, you can hide headers if you want to remove those from PDFs. But this is really nice because we're essentially injecting a clickable link after every anchor tag on the page. So, and this uses the app media print CSS query. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. This is not a crash course in the CSS, but this type of stuff absolutely does help with PDF generation. So we'll get into that a little bit, but yeah, this is just a nice thing to have in the back of your mind if you need to make links clickable in pages. So, okay. So some off the shelf issues that you might run into. There's also some optimization issues that are really important to think about. So by default, Puppeteer, Playwright, when you do a PDF creation, it just sends one giant blob of PDF buffer to you. And as you can imagine, for a big PDF that's maybe a couple hundred megabytes, that's not necessarily a great approach to have. So Puppeteer has a create PDF stream that uses node streams internally to stream the response as it's building it. That's a lot nicer of an experience, and it's a lot lighter too. It's also a little bit faster versus just trying to render a whole PDF at one time and then send it through. So use create PDF stream if you can, if your language or library supports it. If no stream based API is available, Browserless actually used to do a page at a time PDF capture. So we would literally snapshot a page, put it into memory, snapshot the next page, put it into memory, snapshot the next page. But so we had a loop that would just loop through until it would run out of pages and then send it over. And that was a nice workaround before the PDF stream API came out to do very large PDFs without having things break or having the service crash. And there is source code too for that. I can still show you that kind of goes over that just in case the language or library you're using doesn't have a create PDF stream sort of interface. The last thing I like to always call out too is, focus on making your pages faster because that'll naturally just make your PDFs faster as well. So all the same stuff that they tell you to do for like best practices in web architecture, like caching your resources, only sending the smallest payload size possible, slimming down the amount of API or outbound network calls you have. That'll all feed back into PDFs being faster as well. So any performance improvements you make on the page itself naturally slows to the PDFs generation as well. Okay. Deep breath, everybody. I know we're almost at the end of this, and then we can get to some questions. I know this is a lot to take on, and there's a lot to consider. It's a complex topic, so I wanted to give as much information as possible. So apologies if it's really dense, but yeah, my hope is that you can take this and just kind of put it in your back pocket and use it when you need it. So scaling. We talked about PDFs being a very resource intense service. There's a really important thing I'd like to stress is that you want to limit the amount of PDFs that can be generated at a time to like 1 to 5 generated at a time on a machine. That machine size should be at least 2 CPUs and 4 gigabytes, ideally up to like 4 to 8, 4 CPU, 8 gigabyte machine, just because of how intensive it is. So in general, the more RAM you have, the more pages that can be read into memory and rendered quickly, the more CPU, the faster overall performance it is. So if you're dealing with a PDF report that maybe is like hundreds of pages, go for a more RAM heavy machine. If you're just wanting fast PDF generation and it's only a couple of pages, I would say go for a faster CPU machine. In general, CPU helps a lot with doing network calls. And then RAM obviously just helps with reading things into memory, streaming them, that sort of thing. So use that, go forward and conquer. The other thing I will say too is in general, we favor horizontal scaling over vertical scaling. Vertical scaling is great. So that vertical scaling is just a bigger machine. You can think like each node in the machine is larger and thus scales vertically up. So a bigger machine will let you do a faster report and maybe a bigger report, but it won't let you do a lot of them at the same time. For that, you want horizontal scaling, which means a lot of machines in a pool together working and, having a load balancer in front of it that does round robin requests. So that means it just ping pongs requests through them and has them render reports. And just like overall performance, I said before, but like reduce as much, network calls that your page has to make. All the libraries, all that stuff, anything again that improves your page speed will improve PDF reporting throughput. So things like, tree shaking for like Webpack and other, web bundling technologies absolutely will help because it'll cut down on the number of assets that have to be loaded to render your page. In general, the more network calls that Chrome makes, the more time and CPU you need to render. So really cutting down that as minimal as possible. The other thing I like to prefer is vectorized assets over large like PDF or PNG assets. And the reason that is, Chrome has to like fetch that asset first. So there's another network call. Once it's fetched, then it has to render it, resize it, and paint it. So it's quite the long list of things to do in order to get that JPEG or PNG to display versus a vector asset. So you think of like SVGs or, things like Canvas. Those are really fast for Chrome. That doesn't have to do an external network call. It just already has everything it needs on the page. So it just needs to paint it. And that's a really, really, really quick and faster way of doing images versus JPEG or PNGs, if you can. Obviously, if it's a photo or it's a picture of somebody or someplace, you're going to have to deal with JPEGs and PNGs. It's also really hard to handle lazy loading. So lazy loading in Chrome on front end is like you scroll through the page, you get to the bottom, and there's a picture, and that picture loads once it knows it's in the viewport. Disable that for PDFs because otherwise, when you generate a PDF, you're going to have Puppeteer scroll through the page and then wait for all the images to load. And so that just makes it a lot more difficult to render PDFs because not only do you have to load the page, you have to find where the bottom of the page is, programmatically scroll, Chromium and Puppeteer through it, and then wait for all those images to load. So if possible, and if there's a way you can, disable lazy loading just so every asset loads, and that way PDF generation is a lot more easier to handle. I did talk about CSS and like media queries. So CSS, if you're not familiar with, has a really nice syntax for doing media queries. And so you could, obviously set media queries for screen height, width, but you can also set it for print or not for print. So like a great example of this is, when you're in print media, like things like navigation, if you have like a nav bar on your site, or if you have like sidebars, any of that stuff, just hide it because you don't want that in your PDFs, I'm guessing. So use like the media query print in CSS to do that kind of thing. Again, anything that you learn in front end will help with that. So yeah, we did talk about lazy loaded images. So, use Puppeteer's API to scroll to the bottom and then listen for images to be done loading. There's a lot of code on Stack Overflow and other places for how to do that. You essentially want to use Puppeteer's API to do page scrolling, and then you just inject a listener into the page to listen for images to be finished loading with a page.evaluate call. The other flag too that I'll kind of couple of bits of other like font rendering and kerning, like you want font rendering to be none, which we talked about earlier, just helps with rendering. Sometimes if the website you're trying to do a PDF of doesn't look good in print mode, you can do emulate media type screen, which will help a lot with that. That'll look like what a screen sees versus what the CSS for print media looks like. So absolutely use that in places if you don't have direct control of the site. So if you're saying you want to build a PDF as a service, let's say, you might try this instead of just print screen media to see if that produces a better PDF. And then, learn your CSS because that really does go a long, long way. There's all sorts of CSS for print media and PDF media. So like page breaks, word breaks, all those things. There's CSS for that. So it's just a matter of learning that, and that immediately will apply to your PDF export. So yeah, all right, good. We're doing good on time. So obviously take a look at our open source repos to check out how we handle a lot of stuff. Like I said, in V1, we have a function that kind of loops through and does this like stream API based approach. If you don't have that, I can put a link to that in chat. But overall, like PDF rendering with Puppeteer and Chromium is amazing if you know what you're up against. It does require you to know a little bit about front end engineering and some best practices there, but anything you do to make your site better always makes your PDFs better. It'll make them faster, it'll make them slide lighter, it'll make them load quicker. And then the nice thing about learning about PDFs and using them in your web application, or using your web application architecture to generate, means that anything you do to improve PDFs, all those skills that you learn, that is transferable to like front end work as well. So it also just like expands your, toolkit of what you're able to do. So if you're a back end person and you love working in back ends, I would say absolutely consider using Chromium to do this, because it'll also kind of get you some skills in front end architecture versus trying to just use a like Scala only like PDF drawing service, because it'll only keep you kind of stuck in back end life forever, which if that's your game, that's fine. I'm not going to tell you how to live your life, but it's nice to know a little bit about front end, because there's probably going to be a time in your career where, learning a little bit about that and how to do that will come into play. So yeah. All right. I'm going to stop here because that was a lot to throw at everybody and talk about. I absolutely can make these slides available, and I can definitely send links. I'm going to flip over to chat now. And
right. Well, thanks for sharing, Joel. We have 927 people watching. So I've collected some questions from like all the major platforms that we got. But before we get started with that, I want to say thank you for the presentation. This is, by the way, being recorded. I know it's always a bit finicky to find the perfect time slot for people. So in case you missed it, you can watch it later on. And as Joel mentioned, I'll add the links to the PDF as well in the description. Lastly, there's a browser conference coming. So I was looking at the agenda and a lot of AI talks. So why not? Very looking forward to it. Yeah, it's just the agenda seems pretty nice, and you can check out the speakers as well and everything on the website. The link for that can be found in the description as well, and also in the live chat. It is pinned somewhere here. I don't know if you can check it out. But yeah, or just go to browserless.io. You'll find it there as well. But yeah, we have some questions. I'll just add on the screen. What are some alternative libraries or tools that you've used for generating PDF exports, and how does it compare with Puppeteer?
Yeah, so kind of what I mentioned earlier, at Elastic, we used a few node-based libraries to do this, and the predominant way that they work is by using Canvas-like APIs. So if you've ever used Canvas drawing in HTML5, they're very similar to that. So you get like a Canvas instance and you can draw primitives onto that. And so that is a way to go with that. But again, the problem is that it's not going to look exactly like it looks on Chromium, because Chromium has the most up-to-date, Canvas implementation, and it renders, things sanely, and there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people working on Chromium. So this like 1-2 person, maybe even a 10-person, Node.js library that worked on this is just, there's no way they're going to keep up with the speed of, web binaries and building things like that. In terms of how they compare to Puppeteer, so Puppeteer obviously, has to fire up a web browser, has to go to your page, load everything, and then render the PDF. So it's a slow process. That's the nice thing about some of these backend specific languages that do just PDF rendering, is that they, are faster. They can draw faster. They don't need to wait for a browser binary to run and start and load all these network things. But it is a trade-off at the end of the day. So, if you want to just render one chart into a one page, like maybe that's the way to go. But again, it's version changes, API changes. You're gonna have to track those, monitor those pretty closely. Whereas using like Puppeteer's API hasn't changed in, gosh, like 7 years, I think. Like nothing major has changed in it. It's mostly been the same. And so it's pretty stable at this point. And the web, has to be backwards compatible to like the web of the 90s. So you're not going to run into too much crazy stuff there, I would think. So yeah, up to you. But the library approach with your backend specific language, likely going to be faster, likely going to be a lot more lightweight of a process versus using like PDF exports and things of that nature. Yes, so this is a good one.
Good question.
Yeah. So fonts not loading correctly is almost always a user agent issue. So if it's not loading web fonts, look at the user agent and see if you're sending a legitimate user agent. Also, old Chromium, so like older versions of Puppeteer, the Chromium that came with it loaded a version of Chromium that just had troubles with some old web fonts. So I would also recommend potentially upgrading your version of Puppeteer and upgrading your version of Chromium for that reason. But it almost always is a matter of either the font missing on that system or your user agent not being set properly. And once you set that, then it'll finally load it up, because there's a MIME type mismatch that Puppeteer will get back with the web font. That's what it'll kind of show up. So if you load your page or open up DevTools as it's doing this PDF, look at the network calls, look at the content or the console, because it'll tell you if it's not loading a resource properly, and that's likely what the problem is.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. And the other question is, what are some of the best practices for running Puppeteer in a production environment?
Woo, this is a great question. It's a whole nother talk. Yeah, so I would absolutely use a container technology to do it if you can. And there's plenty of examples. That's how we run it. And we have an example on our repo too of how we sort of set up the container and run it. There's just a lot of packages you need to install and make sure that are there for Chromium to even start. Once it's started, there's a bunch of other like flags that you'll need to set to make sure that it runs sanely. So when you Docker run, there's like, you want to use the host inter-process communication Docker flag. So there's a flag for that. And that just lets processes communicate with each other through the host machine's communication protocol. It just improves speed. You also want to disable dev SHM usage as well. The other thing I would say too is be very cognizant of the size of machine you're using. You definitely want something with at least 2 CPUs and 4 GB, regardless of what you're doing. So if you're PDF generating, I would say go even bigger than that if you can. But if it's just like screenshots or even web scraping, data collection, like go the bigger the machine, the better. You'll have a faster experience and you can run more at the same time as well. Um, yeah, don't use the root user to run any of this. So even if you're using Docker, we have a user that we create for the running of the Node app that runs Puppeteer, and it's a non-privileged user. You don't realistically, you don't want something to break out of Chromium sandbox and ruin whatever is running in production or to see what's running in production as a root user. So definitely create a non-privileged user, run your app as that user, and that way if something does happen to break out of any sandboxes for whatever reason, it can't do a lot because it's running as a non-privileged user, and so it's kind of isolated in what it can do. Those are some quick ones, at least for that.
Can you share some best practices for optimizing PDF generation speed and efficiency? I think it was similar to the previous one. Well, not really, but
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say, yeah, there's some differences for sure. Those flags I sent will help with like getting good output, like good, decent PDF generation output. Um, that's super helpful. Again, you don't want to run a lot at the same time because you're limited by CPU at that point, how many network calls can be made at the same time. And so running multiple, like, think like 10, 15, 20 at once on one box is not going to work out well. Your PDFs will slow to a crawl. Some of the network requests will time out. You'll hit a lot of Puppeteer timeout issues. So, yeah, horizontal scale for sure.
yeah, we just crossed 1,000 live viewers. So if you're new, go sign up to the browser conference. And yeah, cool. I couldn't find you on Twitter, Joel. So are you on LinkedIn only?
We have a browserless account on Twitter now. I'll send that over. Actually, I can probably find it right now. I
It's just called
myself am no longer on Twitter.
Google.
Let me find
The
it
other
for you.
question, thanks for sharing the alternatives. In what scenarios would you recommend using Puppeteer over other tools or libraries?
Yeah, this one is a good one. What scenarios would you recommend Puppeteer? Yeah, again, like if you already have a website or a dashboard or, something already set up, like it's a natural thing to just grab Puppeteer because you'll get all of the PDF generation stuff for free. It's already there. It's already, looks nice, I'm assuming. And it just probably is a matter of tweaking a little bit of CSS and you're done at that point once you get Puppeteer up and running. The if you have a web if you have a service that you're running that doesn't really have a web app or a dashboard already ready to go, it is quite a hurdle to get something set up like that just for PDF generating. And maybe you just want like a picture of a chart or something. Like, I don't know, let's say like you have like a status monitoring page or something. It's probably easier to just use a library, a like language specific library for that, just because you won't have to set up a whole HTML structure, deploy that, have Chrome go to it, all that stuff. So I would say, that would be the case is like if you already don't have a web app of some kind or a front end of some kind, then yeah, absolutely. I would say go for like a, you know, back end that doesn't need it. So yes, there is. So this is a great question. Security considerations. So Chrome itself is famous for being able to load stuff from the file system. And that means if you get somebody that wants to export a PDF, and we face this at Elastic all the time, you have to set up network request interceptors. And what that means is anytime Puppeteer makes a network request, you want to look at that request to see if it's trying to make it to the file system or like a local IP. So if you're running in AWS, there's a whole bunch of like IP ranges that are local only interfaces that can load local assets or local tokens and stuff like that. So in our code base, we absolutely disable file-based protocols to load file system contents. And that can be easily done with network request interceptors. Like, so page on request is the URL that you're trying to go to. Does it have the file protocol in front of it or something else that's not, blessed by us as an organization? Okay, we're gonna reject that request. And then even on responses, look at the IP of the response and see if that IP matches a file protocol or matches a local only IP that, DigitalOcean, AWS all sort of inject this like private IP space. Um, so those are the big ones I would be wary of. Is Chrome loading local assets? You don't want that because that's a good pathway for a security vulnerability. Absolutely. Yeah, good question.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks for watching, everyone, till the very end. I know we have to be wary of Joel's time as well. We're only almost closing in on an hour, and well, it was great speaking with you, Joel. And if you want to learn more about it, hear from more amazing speakers, yeah, check out the browser conference. And any quick words on the conference, why you started it, and what are the expectations that people can have? I really like how it's like online as well, so people can attend from wherever they are. But if you'd just like to share a bit more about the event and what people can expect, and we'll have some people, like, you can sign up, you can check out the links in the description or browserconference.com. But yeah, Joel, take it away.
Yeah, this is an event that I've just personally wanted to have for so many years. So there's Puppeteer, there's Playwright, there's Selenium, there's all these libraries out there to automate the web. And there was never one conference that just kind of like talked about web automation as a topic. It was always very specific to like, oh, this is a Puppeteer conference or a Playwright conference. But like, there's so much out there and there's so many libraries and there's so many new things coming out. And each, vendor, their specific web browser will come out with all these features. And unless you go to that specific conference, you're never going to find out in like a general sense. So I really wanted to have an event where people can come, developers, business owners, whatever, to learn about what's going on in the web and like web automation, and not have it be tied to a specific library, a specific company, a specific, browser vendor. So it's just kind of like a way to gather everybody together. Everybody's here to talk about it. The speakers this year are great. We have people from Google, from Microsoft. It's going to be an amazing one this time. So, yeah, sorry, I'll shut up and go from there.
Well, good. I just wanted to mention, like, I've seen like conferences. I think that the VR Devs conference is very popular amongst developers, but there's the other one called that conference, which is also nice. But like you mentioned, something specifically for browsers. But yeah, very cool. And this is not the first one. I think Browserless did it last year as well. So if you want to check that out, what to expect, go for it. But yeah, do register, and hoping to see you there. And once again, thanks, Joel, for joining. I really appreciate it. And thanks for answering all the questions.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Appreciate it. See ya.